much for having me here. I'm excited. This is a topic that is close to my heart. I do a lot of work with families, as Serena mentioned, and there's been an increase definitely of stress and dysregulation for kids as well as parents during this sort of unpredictable, uncertain time. And so today what I'm hoping to do is provide you guys with some strategies that might be helpful and supportive for you to use with families, and leave some space, I hope, for discussion. So if you have questions throughout, you can place them in the chat box, and I'll get to them as we go along. I'll likely kind of wait till the end of the talk because there's a lot of material to go through, and hopefully some of that answers your questions as well. But to start with, I thought we could do a little poll just for me to understand. So I don't know if you can see the poll or not. I hope that's coming out for you. For me to understand how old your child or children are, so that I can gauge my presentation, because the skills that we use with younger kids would vary from the skills that we want to learn to use with teenagers. So it looks like, for those of you here, there's a lot of teenagers and some 6 to 12. So as I go along, I'll try to focus more on the older kids, and remembering that, we want to stay developmentally appropriate in our strategies. So I'll start with just all of these illustrations come to mind when we think of COVID, right? So COVID, and I hope what will happen from this talk as well is we can use these strategies beyond COVID. I think that COVID has definitely brought on new stressors for us. So even, back when kids had to do online schooling, right, and really feeling overwhelmed with that, and having parents work at the same time as the children being at home and not having childcare was also very complicated, and there could be financial stressors that come along. So I guess the bottom line of these visuals is it's normal to have the stress, to feel the stress right now in these abnormal circumstances. So if you are feeling the stress, if your children are feeling the stress, those are all normal reactions, okay? So I'd like to briefly talk about stress, and this is the reference from Center on the Developing Child from Harvard University, and they've developed a model of stress where you could think of stress as positive. So positive stress would be something where there's mild elevations in stress hormones. So for example, looking forward to the first day of work for someone, or school, or having a big presentation coming up, right? So there's the stress level is elevated, but it's positive type of stress. It's not, it's kind of like that exciting stress. It's energetic stress, gets us going. Then there's the tolerable stress. So this is more of the serious temporary stress response that's buffered by supportive relationships, right? So you could think of COVID hopefully as a tolerable stress, right? So it is sort of ongoing right now, but hopefully we are getting support that we need to get through it. So it's an ongoing stress. It's hopefully temporary. We don't know how long, but it's buffered by supportive relationships. And then there's the toxic stress. So that's the stress that you might see in children who are, and adults who are exposed to abuse, neglect, and don't have the benefit of having those protective relationships. And this kind of stress is what leaves an impact on development. And so it's much harder to get past this toxic stress. And so I just briefly wanted to show you the two nervous systems. So when our stress is elevated, we can think of it as activation within our sympathetic nervous system. So what typically happens, and I always try to educate families around the physiological responses that stress causes in our body, because the more we're aware of what happens in our body, the more we're able to regulate. So when we experience stress, our sympathetic nervous system is activated, which means, sometimes our heartbeat starts to go faster. Our breathing becomes faster and more shallow. Sometimes the pupils of the eyes might expand. Gut becomes inactive, so it's difficult to digest in those times where it's hard for you to even eat anything when you're so stressed. Blood rushes to your skeletal muscles and away from your brain, making it hard to think clearly. So a lot of kids find, and adults, right, when we're really stressed out, sometimes we forget things that we already knew because we're so stressed, right, and our mind kind of goes blank. Hormones rush through your body, making you feel anxious, and you expend a lot of energy, so you feel fatigued afterwards. Versus what we want to do is try to activate that parasympathetic nervous system, where we use calming tools to calm our nervous system down. So your heartbeat starts to go slower. You want to do some full slow breathing, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. Your pupils of eyes shrink, gut is active, increased blood flow to gut, lungs, and brain. Hormones rush in, lifting your mood, helping you to relax, and you conserve more energy. Okay, so this is just a basic sort of 101 on how stress affects our body. So I thought it was important to give you a little bit of understanding from that perspective. And then our responses to stress, right? So the basic responses to stress, and you might have heard of it referred in the media as well, is fight, flight, or freeze, right? So when we're stressed, evolutionary speaking, it was advantageous for us to, if we're in the jungle and there's a lion, right, and we hear that roar, we go into this automatic response of likely flight, hopefully flight, right? Because we don't want to get eaten by a lion. So the idea is a lot of these automatic responses like flight, fight, or freeze have developed evolutionary. But what we want to do now that we're not living in a time where we're in the jungle and we're not hunters or gatherers anymore is we want to slow down and respond in a mindful way and slow down those reactions. And when we slow down, we can think a little bit more clear. And I'll talk about those skills in a moment as well. I wanted to present this visual to you, and I know there's a lot of wording here, but I hope this visual is going to be a helpful metaphor for understanding your child's stress. Okay, so the red stuff that you could see at the very top, those are examples of different types of stress that possibly goes into our system, into your child's system each day, right? So you could think of us as having a little bit of a bucket. I call it the frustration tolerance bucket. Okay, so the red stuff is all that stress that's adding to our bucket every day. The green stuff at the bottom is the good coping skills, right? So it's the stuff that helps us cope with that stress. And then the blue stuff is the vulnerability, right? So red things, for example, that gets added is school difficulties, COVID-19 anxiety, right? Lack of sleep or difficulty adapting to change, routine disruption, all of that could add extra stress to that bucket. And when that stress overflows, when that bucket overflows, that's when problems arise. That's when it's really difficult for kids to regulate themselves, right? We are put at extra vulnerability. So children are extra vulnerable if they've experienced abuse and neglect, right? So they have the toxic stress with them. Learning disabilities could put them at an extra vulnerability, as well as attachment difficulties. So if there's relationship conflicts with the parents, for example, that could play a role in terms of creating that vulnerability. Good coping. So some things that you can see as examples here in the green: rest and relaxation, good sleep and eating habits, right? So those are really important. Spending time with supportive people, doing something fun, structure and routine in place, exercise, and identifying and processing feelings, right? So all of those things buffer all that stress that's going in. So hopefully that bucket metaphor makes sense in your mind, because what we want to do is monitor when our bucket or our child's bucket is starting to overflow, and our own, because we all have that frustration tolerance bucket. So maybe you've noticed some days you're more snappy than others, right? And so you want to pay attention to why that is, right? Or your child, right? Some days they're dealing with things a lot better than other days, right? And it could play a role because of the stressors going in, right? So maybe their bucket gets full really early on in the day because they've experienced a lot more stressors that day. And it could be as simple as lack of sleep, right? I don't know about you, but if I don't get enough sleep, I might be a little bit cranky, right? If I am hungry, right? You heard that term hangry, right? Like I might become a little cranky, right? So same thing for kids, right? So we want to be mindful of all that stress that might be going in for them, that's overflowing their bucket. And I want to frame sort of that ability to see kids' stress as kids do well if they can. And this is something that I hope you can walk away from this talk with, is if there's one thing that I want you to remember, is kids do well if they can. And this idea is based on, if you want to read more about it, is Ross Greene's work on emotion regulation. So Ross Greene developed all this scientific work. So there's a lot of books that he published, and there's stuff online if you look him up, around the ability to regulate for kids. And is it that they won't or they can't? And when that simple shift, like when we simply shift that perspective from, well, they're doing this on purpose, they can do this, this is easy enough to do, why are they being resistant, to, okay, what's going on here? Let's pause. Why is this difficult for my child? That gives us a whole new perspective, right? So hopefully that is making sense for you guys. Is there any questions so far? I thought I would pause here for a moment. There's not a lot of you, so I want to make sure it's making sense. And if there's any questions, I can kind of check in with you now. Okay, so I'm assuming everyone's good. If no one's, oh, there's one new message. The last name of the author. So it's Ross Greene. Greene is the last name. Okay. So I want to show you this. So this is a really nice visual to keep in mind. So we've talked about stressors going in, and we've talked about things that help us sort of buffer ourselves and become more resilient to those stressors. And so this is based on, this is another great author. If you're a reader and you like to read, this is something I would recommend as well. It's based on Daniel Siegel's work. He has a wonderful book called The Whole Brain Child. And so this is from his book, from his work. And the idea is that this healthy mind platter are things that we want to watch for, that we're getting each day. These are things that help us be more resilient. So we have sleep time, right? So we want to pay attention to sleep, because sleep is a really important piece to our mood and to emotion regulation for adults and kids alike, right? Physical time, so are they getting enough movement, right? That's really important for healthy brain development. Are they having focus time? So that's, are they being able to engage in activities that have sort of stimulate their intellectual abilities, their focus, right? So we want to have a variety of activities throughout the day, and focus time is an important part of it. Time in is just really being aware and mindful of what's going on for them. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, because it's especially important for those of you that have teenagers. I know many of you mentioned that you have a teenager. Time in is a really important component that I'll talk about in a moment. Downtime and playtime are also important components, right? So having some relaxation time and some playful times, right? And as adults, we forget sometimes to just sit down and have those playful moments with our kids, whether it's through a board game or just laughing about something, but having those kind of easy, playful moments are important, whether a child is 5 or 15. Okay, and connecting time, and especially during COVID, this is a really important piece, right? I think our social connections have become a little bit different right now, but again, and I've heard this from parents where they're concerned about all the online stuff that the kids are doing, but if they're doing it for that social connection, there's a difference between just kind of doing YouTube videos versus connecting with your peers online, right? So really making sure that your child is connecting with peers and having those social interactions. I want to take a moment to talk a little bit more about the brain development, because how our child's brain develops is really key to emotion regulation. So Daniel Siegel, that I've mentioned before in the Whole Brain Child, he talks a lot about the upstairs and the downstairs brain. So you could see that visual kind of talks a little bit about that. So we can introduce this to our children even as, and I like to use this hand model, as our upstairs brain is up here. So this is where our executive functioning skills are, right? So executive functioning skills are where we plan, we think, we can make best decisions based on these skills up here. But our downstairs brain is down here. So this is where the amygdala is, where all our emotions are. So amygdala is responsible for the emotional center. So this is where all the big feelings are, right? So you can introduce it to your child as, you know, all the anger, all the sadness, all the worries, they come from here, right? It's good for kids to be aware how their brain functions, right? And that's okay. All those feelings are great to have, right? And then our brainstem is sort of down here in the model where those automatic responses happen, right? So the fight, flight, or freeze that I discussed before, those are automatic responses. This is where it happens, right? So what we want to show them is that our upstairs and downstairs brain here, they function together. We want them to function together because we want to make the best decisions. But sometimes our brain flips, right? So when we're overwhelmed with emotion, sometimes the upstairs brain flips and we're functioning just on an emotional level and we're not making those best decisions, right? So it's really important to learn strategies. And again, I'll talk about those strategies in a moment, but it's really important for kids to understand what we want to do is have both parts of our brain working together, right? So it's really good to know there's an upstairs and a downstairs brain. Both are great, but we want to integrate those pieces of the brain, right? We want them to work together. Okay, making sense so far, I hope. Okay, so step one would be staying with the emotions. So this is not to say that when your child's lid flips, right, and they're in that emotional place, you can talk about, well, we need to make better decisions here and all of that, right? So it's really important as a first step to just stay with those emotions. And that's something that I find is difficult for parents to do. Because we tend to go into the problem solving mode. So I don't know about you, but it's a very natural thing to do. So as a parent and you see your child upset, you want to try to problem solve around that. But instead of going into that mode, what we want to do is step back and just stay with those feelings for a moment, right? And create that connection with your child by staying in tune with their emotions. So logic is not going to be your primary vehicle during these times. So we want to just stay with those emotions, no matter how nonsensical they might be to you. And you want to acknowledge your child's feeling, right? Or your teenager's feeling. So whether it's through nonverbal signals, maybe a hug, or facial expressions, nurturing tone of voice, and just taking away the judgment and just listening. And that's a huge thing because your child is going to feel heard, right? And you're also modeling really good connections, right? You're modeling those really great ways of connecting with your child. And so this is meant for younger kids. I'm not going to spend too much on this because we don't have a lot of younger kids here, but identifying feelings in different ways, right? So for younger kids, I use a lot of visuals, right? So just helping them understand and articulate some of those feelings. With older kids, hopefully they already can articulate them verbally, so you can just verbalize it for them. If they're feeling overwhelmed, you can just say, oh, it looks like you're feeling really angry right now, or you're feeling really stressed about something or frustrated, right? And by taking that step to really connect on that emotional level could make all the difference in terms of that connection. And I wanted to play a short video for you. I don't know if any of you have seen this one before. It's by Brené Brown. And it's a really nice video in terms of showing how you can use empathy to connect with your child. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and play this.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, so hopefully you guys liked the video and the point it was trying to make. I'm always a fan of, I'm always a fan of her work, because I think she does a really good job of explaining, and showing visuals sometimes really helps in explaining that. So hopefully that was helpful. So the next step after the emotions, so next step would be integrating, right? So what we want to do when we think of that upstairs and downstairs brain is we want to integrate the upstairs and downstairs brain. We want them to be connected and to work together, right? We don't want to get rid of the emotion, but we want ourselves to also be able to think clearly, right? So we want to provide some curiosity into what's going on for a child. So instead of because I said so, try asking questions and explore alternatives, right? So I'm going to give you some examples of that. So here's an example from Daniel Siegel's work that I mentioned. So a child is sitting in the car, I hate you, mommy. And the mom says, well, that's not okay to say. I don't want you to ever say that again. So that's one way to deal with it. But to develop and engage that upstairs brain, another way to do this is when she says, I hate you, mommy, mom responds, wow, you're really mad. And so she's connecting with the feelings. And the girl says, yeah, I hate you. And the mom says, is it because I didn't get you that necklace? And the girl says, yes, and you're so mean. So the mom is exploring so far. And so the mom says, well, that necklace this wasn't for sale. It's okay if you want to keep feeling upset, but if you'd rather, we can be problem solvers and think of another idea. And then she becomes a little more open. How do we do that? It might not happen all the time where they become more open, but they're more likely to be more open to discussing and integrating that upstairs and downstairs brain when we are more curious about what's going on for them and we connect to their emotional stance, right? So the mom was able to connect to her emotions, notice, reflect, wow, you're really mad, and then start to try to integrate those upstairs and downstairs brain. Here's another example of a typical, occurrence that could happen, right? So a child finds a Frisbee in the park, and the mom says, one way to say this is, well, I'm sorry, you can't keep that Frisbee. It doesn't belong to you. Let's put it back where you found it. But another way to exercise that upstairs brain, that thinking brain, that planning brain, is to say, well, I know you want to keep it, so you're acknowledging their own kind of emotions, but what will happen if the other child comes back for it and it isn't there, right? So again, you want them to start thinking outside of, well, this is how it is, right? And questioning. And by doing that, you are developing that upstairs brain, that executive functioning piece of their brain where they can plan, they can make better decisions, and they can organize their thoughts a little bit better. So I'm coming back to that idea of time in. So if you remember from the Healthy Minds Platter, we talked briefly about time in and the idea of being aware and mindful. So time in is really just time to intentionally focus attention on that inner world of our experiences. So exercises the mind side circuits that can integrate our brains and empower our lives, right? So what time in really means is that mindful awareness. So being present with what's happening in the moment and letting go of the judgment. So really practicing, and especially for teenagers, for kids as well, I would recommend is practicing some of that mindful awareness, taking a moment to slow down and really think and reflect what is going on for me, what's going on inside of me, what am I thinking and feeling, and how you focus your mind changes the function and structure of your brain. So there's a lot of research to show that by practicing some of those mindfulness tools, by practicing slowing down, and I'll provide you guys with resources of how to do that. We can change the way that our brain works. We can become more resilient, right? And as families, I always encourage families to make it part of their daily lives, right? So even just slowing down and using our senses in our surroundings, right? So if you go for a walk, just noticing, slowing down to smell the roses kind of thing, right? So noticing, using our senses. So looking around, listening to different sounds, smelling different smells. So becoming more present and aware can really help develop some of those time and skills where we're more aware of ourselves. And so this is another visual from Daniel Siegel's work. Life comes in waves, right? So life happens and waves go kind of up and down just like life, right? So what we want to do is build that resilience where we can get back up, right? And we learn to surf on those waves, right? So might throw us down and we get back up. And so mindful awareness is what helps us get there, right? If I'm going too fast, please let me know. I sometimes get really excited, and I know also we we only have so much time. So if I am going too quickly, please feel free to let me know, and I can slow down. So problem solving. So this is the next step. So after we've talked about that empathy component, that emotional component, it's important to kind of problem solve around it. So I was going to provide an example from my own personal experience. So my 9-year-old son had one day just difficulty getting out for a walk. Just said, no, not going. So first, I got down on his level, said, okay, I reflected his emotions. I said, well, getting ready for a walk seemed really hard for you, right? So I wanted to kind of acknowledge that this was hard for him, even though in my mind, I'm like, well, we're just going for a walk, right? It's not that hard. But for him, it was. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And then explore, right? So what we want to do for the next step is explore why is it hard, right? So remembering that kids do well if they can, right? I don't believe kids are purposely trying to make bad decisions and test us all the time. Sometimes they just have difficulty regulating themselves. Sometimes something is hard and they get stuck. And so showing curiosity. And so I explored with him, what's going on for you? What could be getting in the way? And then reflect and indicate why this is important for you to do this, right? So it's not about walking away and saying, okay, you don't have to take a walk. It's about exploring why this is difficult and how you can problem solve around it and what can you make better, right? And then the best way to do that is also getting your child to come up with ideas to problem solve, right? So I didn't realize this, but transition from screen time, he was just on the computer, to going for a walk was really difficult for him, and he just needed a few minutes of downtime. And that's something I wouldn't have thought of unless I explored from that curiosity stance, right? So it's really important sometimes to just get down on that level, acknowledge their emotions, and take a step back and kind of explore, why is this hard for my child? What is going on for them? Nonverbal signals matter, right? So I'm sure as you know this very well, but when we are talking to our children, especially when when our children are in that emotional stance, we want to pay attention to our eye contact, facial expressions. We want to keep a new sort of a calm tone of voice. Posture matters, gestures, touch. So we want to kind of exude that nurturance stance. Perhaps give them a hug if that's what they need, and provide that support that they need in a nonverbal manner. Again, this is more for younger kids, so feelings check-in is really important. So sometimes just having a visual, but for older kids, you could just check in with them. Sometimes I use a feelings thermometer, so just really on a 1 to 10 scale, how upset are you right now, right? Where 10 is the most upset you can be, 1 is the most relaxed you can be, and you can kind of talk to your teenager about that, or your older child, what is going on for you. This is on a 1 to 5 scale. You kind of play around with the scales, but the idea is for them to start being aware of the intensity of their emotions. So again, this is more for younger kids, but what we want to focus on is proper deep breathing, right? So what we want to get the kids or the teenagers to realize is that when we're feeling overwhelmed, we want to come back to our breath. And so I usually use the sphere, like you see in the picture. And even with teenagers, I use it and they really enjoy the visual, because a lot of times people say, yeah, I know how to do belly breath, but they don't do it properly, right? We tend to breathe through our chest. What we want to do with deep breathing, which helps us relax that sympathetic nervous system, is breathe in through our nose, breathe out through our mouth. And what we want to do is, this is like our stomach. So we want to imagine and have our stomach expand as we breathe in, and then contract as we breathe out. Okay, and we want to use, sometimes visuals are helpful. If not, just physically touching, making sure that they touch their stomach while they breathe, to make sure that they could feel that movement, right? Breathing in through our nose, and you could feel that stomach kind of coming up, and then breathing out, and the stomach comes back down. So it's really, really imperative for this to be sort of, and for families, for teenagers that I work with, I always recommend practicing those deep breathing exercises at least each day, like maybe making part of the routine at bedtime, right? So having a daily practice really helps, because then it'll be that much easier to use those deep breaths to relax ourselves when we're feeling stressed and overwhelmed, right? So kids and parents, you can do it together as a family. Just having some of that deep breathing practice is really important. I'm not going to show this video. This is for younger kids, but if you're interested and you have younger kids, Sesame Street had paired up with Headspace, which is a wonderful meditation app. So Headspace does a lot of audios and videos on mindfulness and meditation, and they've put together with Sesame Street some really wonderful videos on meditation. Again, so if you have younger kids, you can try doing these, and you could look them up on YouTube, Sesame Street and Headspace meditation. Oh.
That's monster meditation.
I wasn't going to play that. Okay. Again, for younger kids, you want to use, so this is a really nice, engaging book. So those of you, even with 6 to 12-year-olds, I've used this with my 9-year-old and he enjoys it. There's a lot of wonderful, engaging activities here to help focus the breath, to help visualize those relaxation activities. So for example, this is one example from the book. So imagine you're holding a candle. Okay, so we can do it together. Take a long breath in and then slowly blow the air out towards your candle. And you want to make your candle flame wiggle, but don't blow it out, right? So we're going to do a long breath in and then slowly breathe out. And again, a long breath in and slowly breathe out. And a long breath in. And now blow your candle out. Ah, right? So even that saying ah at the end, it's kind of like that relaxation stance, right? So we want to play around with what the kids are interested in. Sometimes they'll enjoy exercises that have visualization. Sometimes it has to be more physical, right? So they might benefit just from having a hand on their stomach. But engaging your child in these activities on a daily basis could really pay off in terms of their ability to use those strategies when they need it. Um, Again, movement breaks. I feel like this is really important, especially for those that are going to be homeschooling or online learning now with COVID. And, there's not as much push towards going out at recess and moving around, engaging kids in fun activities. So with younger kids, you could use visualization, you know, slither like a snake, right? So moving your body like a snake, waddle like a penguin, right? So moving around in different ways. You can use yoga techniques, or you can make it into a game. So a lot of kids, especially 6 to 12, who might be sort of resistant to a lot of movement breaks, really get engaged in this roll some brain breaks. So you get a dice and all you do is, throw the dice, and if it lands on, let's say, a 1, then they choose the color column and then they get to do, let's say, red 10 jumping jacks, right? So they get engaged in game type of format for movement breaks. So again, coming back to the Healthy Minds Platter, physical exercise is really important for good brain development and emotion regulation. And then at the end of the day, this is just one example, but it's really important to develop coping tools checklist, right? So coming up with it with your child, along with your child, of things that work for them, and they can go back to it when they feel stressed and overwhelmed. Could be as simple as just listening to some music, doing some yoga, some deep breathing, or even just crying, right? So coming up with ideas with your child to really just be able to relax in the moment and to go back to this coping tool checklist. I wanted to read this quote for you. This is by Mila Kabat-Zinn. So those of you who might be familiar with mindfulness and mindful parenting, I do a lot of work around that. And Mila Kabat-Zinn, along with John Kabat-Zinn, they've sort of developed a whole mindfulness program, and they wrote a wonderful book on mindful parenting. And so this quote I'll read to you comes from this book. The wonderful gift of mindfulness is that we can stop ourselves and ask, what am I feeling? What is it like from my child's point of view? When you can do that, you often see things that you didn't let yourself see before because you were so caught up in that reactive mode, which is very limiting. So I like this quote because it helps us see that by slowing down and bringing that sense of curiosity, we're able to respond to our children from a more mindful perspective rather than just going into that reaction mode, right? Which is often something that, we regret sometimes, right? Like, oh, I yelled at my child. I should have just calmed down myself, right? So it's really important to keep this in mind. Benefits of mindfulness with children. So using those strategies that we talked about, so children have less stress and anxiety and sadness, better ability to cope with change and other stressors, better sleep habits, and feeling more connected, more resilient, and happier. right? So I'm going through this really quickly because I want to make sure we have time for discussion, but there are a lot of benefits. And if you, and I should mention, if you do want to learn more about mindful parenting, I will be doing a free webinar through York Hills on Wednesday at 4 o'clock this week. So if you go to York Hills website, you'll be able to register for the workshop on mindful parenting, which will give you a little bit more insight into what I'm talking about, because I know I'm sort of glossing through it, but hopefully if you can make it for that, that will help you maybe understand some of these concepts. So again, coming back to reaction versus response, right? So mindful parenting, kind of coming from that slow reflective stance, not just reacting based on impulse. And the nice thing about it is it takes into account not only long-term effects, but stays in line with our parenting values, right? So we all have these values that we want to pass on to our children, I hope, right? So by responding in a mindful way from that curiosity stance rather than just reacting, we are able to stay true to our values more often than not. And responding is empowering, right? So pause whenever you feel yourself about to react, take a deep breath, step back, and give yourself the opportunity to respond. So this is a nice acronym for you to kind of keep in mind. So this is one way to use some of that timeout kind of for yourself to be able to respond to your child instead of just reacting. So the acronym is TANGLE, T is for timeout, right? So just taking that mental or physical break away from your child. So if possible, physical, where you could go to another room, but if not possible, just taking a mental break, just taking a moment, just composing yourself and inhaling and exhaling, right? So that inhale and exhale could be very powerful in bringing our own emotional stance down, right? So that we're not flipping our own lids, we're able to integrate both parts of our brain, and name it, right? So what is it that upset me so much? What am I feeling, right? So reflecting on that, grounding yourself, so observing your own inner judgments, loosening up, so maybe doing like a little stretch or a little walk just to kind of do a little bit more relaxing and grounding for ourselves, and evaluate your mind, right? So after that, at the very end, am I able to just, after all these steps, am I able to think clearly? Am I less emotionally aroused so that I can be there for my child in a mindful, responsive way? Okay, so hopefully this is a good acronym to remember for you guys, and to use when you need it. So I'll briefly kind of go through the self-care tools. I think it's really, I don't think any parenting talk is, able to kind of take this portion out of it. I think self-care tools are really important um, because of this. So this is a really good visual reminder. So when we're in the plane, we're always reminded to sort of put the mask on ourselves first and then the child. And so self-care is about that, just making sure that we're there for a child by taking care of ourselves so that we can be, right? So if anyone wants to kind of share some of the tools that you use to reduce stress, you can type that into chat. I would love to hear some of the things that you find helpful, and it might be helpful for other people in the audience. But I know in our busy world right now, we can use all the tools that we can. So this is a really important reminder. So I think our society tends to think that self-care is selfish, but we need to reframe it as, self-care is the greatest gift you can give to those you love, right? Because then when you're taken care of, when you're there emotionally and you're able to be balanced as a parent, not only are you modeling how to take care of yourself and how to be emotionally present for your children, but you're able to connect with your children more that way. So I want to provide you with some resources before I stop talking. And these are some of the things that I've already mentioned. So The Whole Brain Child by Daniel Siegel, Tina Payne Bryson, wonderful book. It talks about how the brain connects to our emotion. The Explosive Child, A New Approach for Understanding and Parenting Easily Frustrated, Chronically Inflexible Children by Ross Greene, who I mentioned earlier. There's another book called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk by Adele Faber and Elaine Maslish. There's a teen version as well that you can find by these authors as well. Um, for younger kids, I love the books by Karen Young. So she has her own website, and there's a lot of wonderful books on there. Hey Awesome and Hey Warrior is a wonderful read. So those of you that have kids from 6 to 12, those are wonderful books. They're educational in a way, but also engaging and fun. Some videos here in terms of kind of connecting to the breath, again, for younger children. And the mindfulness apps that I mentioned. So one would be Headspace, which has a lot of free audios, videos for different age groups. And Calm is another good one that you might want to check out. And as I mentioned, there's workshops for families at York Hills website, and I'll be running the Mindful Parenting one on Wednesday at 4. Okay, so I want to end with this slide because I think it sums up a lot of the concepts that we talked about and comes back to that idea of, kids do well if they can by Ross Greene. Okay, so reframing from, well, they just won't do it to they're having trouble with it. They just can't, right? And that in itself shifts our perspective from a judgmental stance to a curious stance, right? And we are less likely to become frustrated with our children and more likely to want to support them and strengthen them through working with them, right? So I want to kind of pause here and allow some time for questions. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. So I hope everything was clear, and I'm happy to open it up for discussions. So there's a question about the slides sharing. So I don't mind sending along my slides. Did you want me to? And
Yeah, so
maybe it's a question
Marina,
for
why
you.
don't we collect your slides and we'll send it out as a follow-up to this event.
Sure. I'm happy to share if it's helpful and to have those resources. I'm happy to share that. Um, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen is great. Yeah. So I see some of you guys have read it. Is there any other questions? And you can also unmute yourselves if you'd rather, say the question, or um, you can type it into the chat as well. Or maybe everything just made sense and you guys are familiar with everything here.
You probably did such a wonderful job that there aren't any questions.
Thanks. I kind of glossed through it kind of fast, hoping to, if there are questions, I wanted to make sure to address it. If there's anything that, if there was any confusion, I'm happy to kind of clarify that right now. And if not, we'll maybe end it there. I don't know.
All right, so it seems like there aren't any questions. And Marina, if people did have any questions and wanted to connect with you later on, are you open to receiving emails from our folks?
Yeah, that's fine. I have on the first slide, I've included my email, so feel free to send me an email if there's any follow-up questions.